Hi there, and welcome to this video lecture for Philosophy of Psychology Week 3. And in this week, we're going to be looking at psychology and social power. And we're going to be reading three texts that really sort of look at the history of psychology from a sort of critical historical perspective. So we'll be drawing on the social sciences as a whole this week: sociology, history, philosophy, to try and understand the sort of historical context of sociology, and to have a look at Nicholas Rose's arguments in his essays, and as we'll look at in this lecture, about the history of psychology kind of undergoing this important transition in the late 19th century, where it's no longer a sort of theoretical discipline, but sort of defines itself in terms of resolving these practical problems within modern institutions like prisons, schools, hospitals, and so on. So we'll take a look at this claim in this lecture. So how do the psychological sciences define themselves? According to Rose, there's a key claim which is made by the psychological sciences, psychology, psychiatry, etc. And this key claim goes that the history, their own history, the history of the psychological sciences, can be ordered into a narrative of continual progress. So continual progress and development, adding knowledge on knowledge, centered on the deployment of the experimental method in the 19th century. So that's the sort of key claim, that the experimental method in the 19th century allowed for this sort of change in how psychology operated, and once that was put in place and settled, there's a kind of continual history of progress from that point. Now, the problem with this claim, as Rose sees it, is that what is now considered marginal and eccentric was once seen as central. And if we look at the actual history of science, including the actual history of psychology, it's one of continual disruption and fragmentation. So it's not a sort of single narrative of progress, not a single linear development towards higher forms of knowledge, but one of disruption and fragmentation. And we'll take a look today at Rose's theory about this history and how it develops, and why it can be understood in that sense, and what that tells us about the discipline today. So we're looking at how the psychological sciences define themselves in relation to history. What story do they tell about who they are and the role they play? So as we saw, Rose is going to say that they are fragmented. Examples of fragmentation might be sort of the fact that disciplinary boundaries are continually being made and remade. There's no sort of settled historical definition of what makes something part of psychology. As we know, psychology only separated from philosophy, logic, and medicine in the 19th century. Now, Rose also mentions these sociological histories of psychology. And as he tells it, they have a sort of specific purpose, or they want to do a kind of specific thing, these narratives. They want to delegitimize the narrative the psychological sciences tell themselves. So to sort of criticize that narrative of progress, of sort of continual development of knowledge. And instead of this, the sociological histories that have been written have seen the history of psychology as driven by external factors, in particular economic, political, and professional. So an example might be sort of links with the demands of capitalism and capitalist production, and that's the thing that kind of drives psychology and the way it works. The need for regulation of the labor market, for example. Political issues might be the state and institutions of social control, which sort of drive the history of psychology. Professional power, of course, we might say, desires to maximize itself, and therefore leads to claims to have specialist knowledge and techniques that are unique to the discipline. So it's these kind of external factors that are that are the key things according to the sociological histories. And as we'll see, Rose disagrees with this this reading as well. It's too much focused on these sort of big claims and these big forces. And as we'll see, when Rose looks at history, it's the sort of concrete practices that count, the sort of it's the sort of nuts and bolts of what people are doing in institutions that sort of drive social change. So, on Rose's story of the history of the psychological sciences, psychology as we know it today emerged out of attempts to resolve problems related to the employment of the human factor in the institutions of modern life. So it's not a theoretical history, but one of an attempt to solve practical problems thrown up by modern institutions. So, for example, psychology is not sort of defined on this view by sort of centuries of sort of theoretical speculation about the soul, what it's capable of, how it works, what it's made of. It's not a theoretical thing, but an attempt to solve these practical problems in modern institutions. It's problems to do with the human factor. In other words, when people are sort of gathered in large numbers, in large groups in these modern institutions of hospitals, schools, prisons, and so on, the question is how are they to be sort of arranged? How are they to be sort of employed efficiently? How are sort of problem areas to be sort of designated and controlled? And this is what drove psychology to become the discipline it is today, with the social role that it plays today, its sort of experience in these institutions of modern life. So psychology constituted the domain of subjectivity, Rose says, as itself a possible object for rational management. So it becomes a kind of discipline that is able to manage problems of subjectivity, problems of the human factor that emerge in these institutions where large numbers of people are kind of employed and need to be organized, arranged in an efficient manner so that the purposes of the institution can be fulfilled. Now, psychology was able to play this role because it provided the techniques and methods to get information and intelligence about what was going on in the minds of individuals. So this information might have been written reports, charts, graphs, or statistics. It might have detailed, for example, the skills of employees, their health, their ability to work with others, their propensity for criminality and violence. So in this way, you could sort of bring about a statistical mapping of problem populations, those who are sort of less disposed to work well with others, those who have a greater propensity for criminality and violence. So it allows people to be ranked according to how far they are from the norm. That idea of normalization is very important here. People whom they dealt with might be hysterical women, unruly school children, so-called feeble-minded children, workers suffering sort of industrial accidents, injuries, soldiers with PTSD, which of course at the time was called shell shock after the First World War, because people didn't really understand what it was. But all of these sort of illnesses caused social problems, caused problems of sort of coordination, and sort of problems about how to sort of get individuals in large groups working together. So this sort of ranking, this norming came about as a sort of solution to those problems. Psychology, as Rose says, provided the vocabulary, the information, and the regulatory techniques for the government of individuals. So that word is purposeful when he talks about psychology playing a government role, that it's sort of playing a role of sort of managing these conflicts, managing the sort of the disbursement of individuals in these institutions, managing the sort of decisions about about how you figure out what they're suitable for, where they should best be placed, whether it's the school, the asylum, are they suitable for the military? So these are the kind of things that become central to psychology. So the central claim here is that the psi disciplines are techniques for the disciplining of human difference. So classifying individuals, measuring their capacity and conducts, and recording their attributes and deficiencies. This provides for a regime of visibility, which allows for a common framework in which all are observed. So all are observed according to the common kind of framework, the common grid. Evaluation of their conduct, of their manners, and so on leads to a kind of grid of codability of personal attributes. So you can kind of measure their attributes in relation to others, who's doing well, who's doing not so well, and have them all lined up on a sort of common scale so that you can see where everybody sits in relation to everybody else. And these things establish a grid of perception for registering the details of individuals' conduct. So individuals can now be evaluated in relation to a set of norms established by the comparison with peers. That's what psychological testing does. There's an interesting sentence that Rose uses in this piece on Calculable Minds, where he says, if scientists read the book of nature, it is only because they first transformed nature into a book. It's about how you make things readable, legible, how you make them things you can sort of see, you can get a purchase on. How can you get access to individuals' propensity to be good and sort of honest workers? How can you get access to their propensity to violence, right? And so these sort of techniques are sort of making all of this legible, making it visible, transforming, we could almost say transforming the soul into a kind of book that can be read by the techniques that are being developed by psychologists. So in terms of this idea of psychology as kind of disciplining human difference, there are two central tasks that the psi disciplines perform, the psychological disciplines are going to be called upon to perform. Firstly, they assess individuals to determine what environment or regime they are best suited for. Do they have the temperament for the armed forces? Do they need a special kind of schooling because of delinquency, feeble-mindedness, etc.? And secondly, the psychological disciplines advise on the organization of individuals and arrangement of tasks to minimize work problems and conflicts. So minimizing industrial accidents, minimizing cases of insubordination, making sure that the whole institution sort of runs smoothly. That's the job that's being done here to sort of bring about this efficiency within institutions. So a phrase that Rose uses in this article is the science of individualization. And what he means by this is the capturing of the properties, the capacities and energies of the human soul in material form. Right? And this is central to all the techniques that psychologists discovered in the 19th and early 20th century. Techniques to sort of render the kind of capacities of individuals sort of material and therefore comparable with others and sort of placed on a common scale where everybody can be kind of judged and allocated and sorted. So these properties were captured in charts, in pictures, in measurements. The demand in new institutions for managing human difference led to the invention of these new techniques in the psi disciplines that referred, say, poor school performance or tendency to delinquency or crime as attributes of the soul that were discovered by psychology. So it's like psychology is sort of shining a light on the soul in sort of using these techniques to draw out the propensities and the capacities of human beings. And effectively, the mind is materialized. The mind begins to take is something that begins to take on material form in the way it's made legible by psychological techniques. So the collection of data on a large number of individuals under controlled conditions led to two important things: standardization and normalization. Those are the two things that Rose thinks are the consequences here: standardization and normalization. So comparable information collected on a number of subjects led to the norming, as individuals were judged according to how they fit on the curve. So you can see here, this is a sort of standard normal curve where you've got sort of outliers at both ends, and the norm is created by the average, this sort of big clump of people in the middle who are sort of average. So that creates our idea of normality. So this created idea of normality, which then some individuals were judged to be lacking. So this is how psychologists were able to manage individual difference. Deviant or non-normal individuals were rendered visible. They're rendered visible through these kind of normal graphs or norming graphs and other sort of techniques. They're rendered visible and therefore categorized according to their propensities on whatever sort of measure or whatever thing is being judged. So in this way, we can see the way that the psychological disciplines on this reading became important to a certain project of social control. The psi disciplines became influential and important because they came to assist in this project. And in this way, psychology was part of a project to manage individual differences in order to maximize individual and social efficiency. Right? So it's about sort of managing these differences in order to make sure that the sort of the sort of big agglomerations and the big institutions run smoothly, that there's as much sort of efficiency and as little friction in terms of how they work as possible. And that means managing the masses of individuals that run and work in these institutions. So psychology provides techniques for the management of individuality, seeking to mold and shape the psyche in order to fabricate useful, adjusted, and compliant individuals. So it's serving a particular social imperative. It's maximizing individual and social efficacy, or efficiency rather. It's worthwhile just quoting this this passage from Calculable Minds, as it really, I think, sums up the position Rose wants to take in this article. On page 186, he says, "The psychological sciences did not consolidate themselves into disciplines around the timeless project of understanding the human mind." Right, so they're not theoretically driven. They didn't emerge from theoretical speculation, but around contingent and historically variable problems of institutional life, the psychophysical capacities and behavioral phenomena which they required and sought to produce, and the variability and vicissitudes of the human subjects to which they accorded a visibility and a permanence. So note the critique of the sociological view as well here, as well as the sort of way that psychology sees itself as sort of emerging from theoretical speculation. Right, but unlike the sociological view, it's not simply driven by economic forces like capitalism, but it emerged in real practical problems of modern institutions. In the psychological complex, Rose says that psychology of the individual was not formed in the study or the laboratory. It crystallized around the issues relevant to the objectives and mode of functioning of social practices. So it sort of fit into the purpose and what those practices were trying to achieve and making them more efficient. The school, the reformatory, the army, the factory, the modern institutions in which the behavior of large numbers of people must be coordinated, and the need for new modes of measurement and assessment to make possible this coordination of behavior on a large scale. This is what sort of drove psychology to become the discipline it is today. This experience around the functioning of social practices and how people could be sort of coordinated and managed to be able to fit into the needs of those practices and sort of drive them as efficiently as possible. So this theory of psychology's history, again, upholds this idea of discontinuity, which we saw in Foucault's account a number of weeks ago. And we can see is very much an important part of what Rose is saying about the history of psychology, that its history is discontinuous. The understanding of psychology in the 20th century emerged through a concrete, practical history of interaction within modern institutions. It was not brought about by social exigencies or demands. That, of course, is the sociological view, but emerged from a set of techniques and strategies for mapping and measuring populations. All right, so we've had a look at Nicholas Rose's articles this week, and the sort of sociological historical reading of the history of psychology as something that developed through these institutions, and the sort of techniques of the sort of disciplining and of difference that developed as psychology sort of exercised itself in these institutions. So that's what we're going to focus on. And of course, there's also the reading by Philip Cushman this week, which is also a kind of historical analysis of psychology. So we're going to focus on this question this week, and there are 4 tasks. As usual, there's the hypothesis markup assignment, which is on Nicholas Rose this week. There's a voice thread task, which is on Cushman and the idea of self-domination. There's a discussion post on Nicholas Rose, and finally, quiz 3, which is due at the end of the week.